We are in the it's hard to say the climax of the book of Hebrews, but we're in Hebrews chapter 11 tonight. And I'm not going to recap all the way up. I'm not going to recap all 10 chapters tonight. It's on YouTube now. But to grasp, if you'll bear with me just a moment tonight, that to grasp Hebrews 11, I identify in so many ways with what I experienced from the writer of Hebrews, because he's really having to motor through to make his point, and you get the sense he wants to stop and really preach on each one of these pictures of faith, but he's making a point, and to really grasp Hebrews 11. I mean, we all know Hebrews 11. We've all read it. We've heard it our whole lives. The Hall of Faith, and we see it. I don't know about you, but many of us have not only ever seen it, ever heard it preached or taught in its own sort of set apart, like it's a unit unto itself. What it's not, obviously, it's at the back end of a letter where he's coming to the point. So really, to grasp this, I want to recap just a few points from Hebrews chapter 10. Not the entirety of what we went through last week, but just a few points. And we'll open up tonight, just again, coming to Hebrews 10:19, where he hits the therefore. Therefore, brothers and sisters, based on everything now, what now? What do we do now? And as I mentioned last week, I've always been sort of like a so what kind of guy. So what do I do with that? What does that look like? What do I do with that in my life? So you told me all this, so what? So that's what this is. This is the therefore. This is the practical application. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we have boldness. Boldness to enter into the Holy of Holies by the blood of Yeshua. We have confidence. And the word boldness, parousia, it speaks of having a confidence walking into a situation that you normally wouldn't walk into with confidence. It's being able to walk. It's a confidence in an unlikely situation in many ways. So he says we have a confidence, we have a boldness to enter into the Holy of Holies. And then it goes, verse 23 says, so first of all it tells us to enter in. Verse 23 says, let us hold fast the unwavering confession of hope, for he who promised is faithful. We talked about this last week quite a bit, and we've talked about it before because this is the third time in the book that the word confession is used. And the word used there is homologia, made of two words. Homo, same, logia, word, the same word. You hold unwaveringly to that same word, to that same truth, because he who promised, when it says he's faithful, it says he's true. He who promised is a promise keeper. He who promised never fails. He who promised, if he said it, he does it, you can take it to the bank. Amen. He who promised is faithful. So we hold firm to that same word. When you first believed, you hold firm to that same word, who Yeshua is. Whatever God says, that's what I say. The same word. I hold firm to the same word. Whatever he says is what I say. Because whatever he says is true. He who promised is true. He who promised is faithful. And so that's where that idea of confession is. I'm saying what God says. I'm saying what God says about me. What God says about me is true. So when I confess my sins, I'm confessing, I'm saying the same word that God says, that this is not okay. That I recognize that this destroys me. And in specificity to confess, to come with that same and say, Lord, cleanse me and make me know. If we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins. So he says, let us hold firm to that homologia, to that same word, that what he says he will do. Verse 24, and I'm motoring through the recap. So it says, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good deeds. And do not neglect our own meetings. Do not neglect our gathering together. As is the habit of some. It's become a habit for some. It's become the word habit there has to do with our traditions. Has to do with the things that we've done so often they become tradition. For some, it's become a tradition to neglect meeting together. So he's saying, let's not neglect our own meetings as some have made the tradition of doing, but encourage one another all the more as you see the day approaching. So he says, stir up. There's only one other place where this word is used, parazusmos, and it's a really strong word, and that's in Acts 15:39. And it speaks actually of the sharp argument between Paul and Barnabas that caused them to part ways. But it's using that same word. It's talking about a provoking, a sharp provoking. And like the idea that we talk about iron sharpening iron, a provoking, it's saying you need to stir up, to provoke, to spark each other, to press the issue with each other toward love and good deeds, toward faithfulness. Keep pressing forward. In the midst of trial and persecution, how are we going to keep the enemy from defeating us? He says, first of all, keep approaching the throne. Keep approaching the throne of God. Keep going to the Lord and saying, Lord, who do you say? What do you say? Who do you say I am? In the midst of what you're facing, this is a body of believers. These are Jewish believers that are facing severe persecution. Not to the point of death yet. He later says in chapter 12, but they're being persecuted. The persecution is coming from the government, the persecution is coming from family members, it's coming from the community, it's coming from every direction. So he says, stay in relationship with God, keep saying what he says, keep holding firm to what you knew at the beginning, to what you knew, what you know. And he refers back to, you'll remember back in chapter 2, he says, what we confess, hold firm to that confession. That's the first time he used homologia, the same word. He said, it's been revealed to you, not only by the Lord, but by signs and wonders, and by the Spirit of God in you, working in you. You know what the Lord has done. You hold firm to what you know. You keep remembering what is true. Because what's in front of your face, the circumstances in front of your face, can be overwhelming. We talked about last week, I jokingly talked about, I'll watch these war movies and I'll see how exhausted. Like you'll see sometimes these guys are running in battle and war on no sleep. And there are moments where someone in the midst of battle can get so weary, so tired, that they lose sight. They forget at that moment who's at home waiting, wife, children, mother, father, whoever. They're just so tired they can't see. And there's a part of them that just wants to lay down and go, I'm tired. I just want to go. And the brother in battle comes alongside and says, no, you're not going to die here. And picks him up and says, we're going. And the picture in my mind is that father jumping out of the stands in the 92 Barcelona Olympics when his son, just dropped in the middle of the race and he went out and was like, we're going to the finish line. That picture of coming out of the stands like, no, we're going to make it. And I know you're tired. Get up, provoke one another. Get up, keep pressing toward what God has for you. Don't die in the desert, basically. Don't die as our forefathers did in the desert. Those who stopped short of the promise. No, you press on, you provoke one another. Don't assume others are going to be fine. The temptation to neglect, the temptation to drift away from the faith that we first had is dangerous. In the midst of trials and pains, there's this temptation to stop trusting, to stop believing, to stop having trust and faith that God will do what he said he would do. You begin to get overwhelmed by what's in front of your face, by what we call the reality of the circumstances. And we call that reality versus the reality of what God said. So he says, so hold fast to your confession. Hold to that same word, to that homologia, that same word. Because those who failed to hold to the truth of what God said died in the desert. So spur each other on because this is serious. The consequences of not finishing, of not trusting God are dire. And so in Hebrews chapter 10, he says it's a frightening thing to fall, terrifying thing to fall into the hands of an angry God. So you keep pressing on. God is not satisfied with our faithlessness. You keep trusting him. You keep knowing that what he said is true. Don't drift away in 2:1. And don't stand away in Hebrews 3:12, because if you walk away in Hebrews 6:4, it's almost impossible to come back. And after all the Lord went through to restore us, he will not have his sacrifice, his mercy, his grace mocked and insulted. You don't want to do that, so be afraid of that. It's terrifying. Approach the throne of grace. Keep confessing what you know. Keep confessing what is true. Keep saying the same word that God says. Keep holding to the truth of what God has said about Yeshua, what God said about you. What God says about you is what's true. That's what's true. There are times when we'll face criticisms. And the question is, it doesn't mean those criticisms aren't valid. Some of the criticisms are valid. The question is, because when the Lord criticizes me, it's what we call constructive criticism. The heart behind his criticism is to build me. And sometimes he has to deconstruct some things I've built up in my own life that I've allowed the enemy to have his way in my life. And so in his love, the heart of the Lord is always, even in his criticism, is to make us and to build us. It's not always a painless process. So when we face criticism, we don't just go, you know what, I'm just not receiving that. What we do is we say, Lord, what do you say? What do you say? Is that accurate? Show me. If it is, change me. What do you say about me? Lord, everything that you say, may it find seed. May the seed plant in my heart. I'm devoted to obeying and being what you call me to be. And whatever is not from you, whatever was said that is not from you, may it be hot air that just goes away. Whatever is not of you, just wash it away. In Yeshua's name. What do you say? Because what you say is true. And here's what he says. He says, I love you. I love you, and I'm making you into my image. And there's a lot more that he says if we turn our ears and our hearts to hear his voice. It says, so keep holding the truth of what God has said, and then keep meeting together to encourage one another. And then in chapter 10, verse 32, he's told us to spur one another on. And then what's really cool is, in verse 32, he begins to exemplify that. He begins to model it for us. So here's how you spur one another on. Remember, don't you remember when you first believed? You remember what you went through early on? Do you remember of your early confession, that same word you said? And he begins to recall the persecution they faced. They faced persecution. They have suffered. They've persevered. And so he spurs them on. He provokes them. Keep persevering. Verse 32 says, remember the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a great struggle with sufferings. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to abuses and afflictions. And other times you became partners with those who treated you this way. Who were treated this way, excuse me. For you suffered along with the prisoners and joyfully accepted the plundering of your possessions, knowing that you have for yourselves a better and lasting possession. You remember early on? They took your stuff, but you knew they came in and stole your things. And you knew, I don't need that, because I see something more. There's a lasting possession. Don't you remember when you could see clearly, and in your weariness on the battlefield, there's something that you're going toward. Get up, spur on. Don't you remember? And he says, therefore, I love this in verse 35. Therefore, do not lose your boldness. Same word. Same word. Don't lose your boldness, which has great reward. For you need perseverance so that after you've done the will of God, you may receive the promise. So, he's saying, listen, why should you lose your boldness? You get to boldly, with confidence, approach the throne of God. And yet in front of mere men who can take away possessions that will be gone with the fire, in front of them, you're going to lose your boldness and your confidence. It's a contrast. If I have boldness and confidence with the Lord, why should I fear man? What can man do to me? Don't lose your boldness, for you have to press through. Perseverance. The theme that you see the theme throughout the book of Hebrews is Yeshua is greater. He's better than. Don't lose sight of that. But you got to finish. It's a persevering faith. Our fathers, says in 4:1, they died in the desert. It says, fear then, following their example, lest you fall short. Because the promise is right there. It's just on the other side of the Jordan. You're so close. Don't get freaked out by some giants in the land. Don't forget where God brought you from. Remember? Remember the Red Sea. Remember the early days. Remember when you suffered. You dealt with this. And then he quotes the Septuagint version of the Habakkuk, chapter 2. It says, but my righteous ones shall live by their faith, by trust. And if he shrinks back, my soul takes no pleasure in him. And then so he says, he quotes, the Lord says, the ones who live by trust, who keep trusting me, are the righteous ones. Those who shrink back, that's not according to my will. My soul doesn't pleasure in that. You've got to trust me. And then here's how he spurs them on. He basically becomes like a cheerleader. He goes, but who are we? Verse 39. Which ones are we? He says, we are not among the timid ones. In the same word, he goes, we are not among the shrinking back. That's not you. That's not us. So the Lord, he quotes Habakkuk 2. The righteous live by faith. The Lord doesn't take pleasure among the ones who shrink back. We are not among the shrinking back ones. Yes. That's not who we are, he says. Who are we spurring them on? We are the ones who keep going forward into God's rest, into God's promise. Who are those who, in the face of persecution, are going to stop trusting God, who said he'll do what he do, that he will do what he said he'll do? Are we going to stop trusting him? No, he says. We're going to press on. We are the faithful. We are the trusters. We're the ones that trust. The righteous are the ones who keep trusting, who live trusting. That's us. We're not the shrinking back ones. All this faith coming forth. And then that brings us to Hebrews 11. You can't get into Hebrews 11 without seeing that, where he's saying, who are we? He's spurring them on, and then he says, listen. The righteous live by their trust. That's who we are. And you may say, well, what even is faith? What is trust? Well, I'll tell you what trust is. Trust is the evidence of things hoped for. The substance of things hoped for. The evidence of what you don't see. Faith, therefore, he says. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for. Again, hoped doesn't mean, I wish, maybe. It means things that are good and to come, but they're not here yet, but they are, they're coming. Faith is knowing, is the evidence, the substance, of what is coming, of things hoped for. It's the evidence of things not yet seen. It's really not just not seen, it's things seen, but not yet, is what it's expressing. Your circumstances, your persecution, that's what you see. Your weariness, the government, the Roman government at the time, the intense persecution on the believing community was very in your face, was very real. It was very seen. He says, but trust is the substance of things that you know, the good things that you know are coming. The evidence of the invisible, or what you can't see. Your circumstances, what's in front of your eyes, they scream at you and say, God's not here. God's abandoned you. The land's full of giants. We can't do it, but faith says, I know that if God is pleased with us, he will certainly bring us into the land. I know. It's the evidence because he said so. That's all I need. I mean, I know it's become like certain things I've heard so much in my life I am almost embarrassed to say them because they're like cliches. Like I'm like, well, that's such a cliche, but whatever. Where people would say, well, God said it and I believe it and that's good enough for me. That's the deal. That's the deal. Cliche or not. It's cliche because it's true. If God said it, it is. He cannot lie. He does not lie. Sometimes we misinterpret what he says. Sometimes we twist it into our filter. Have you ever had kids say that? Have you ever had your kids twist what you said?
Yes.
And you're like, I didn't say that. Oh yes, you promised. No, there were some ifs and if you will, yada yada. And there was another part of that. But sometimes we have to keep going and say, Lord, did I hear you right? But what he said is true. And what his word says is true. It says, for by faith, by it the elders received commendation. Most versions say something like this. The NIV says, this is what the ancients were commended for. Or, for by it the men of old gained approval. But literally what it says is, in these, but basically, by faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, and taught to in these, because the ones who bore witness, or the ones who testified, the ancient ones. Anyway, that's a big conglomeration. That I believe that, I see this as saying, the lives of the ancient ones testify to this reality. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, and the lives of the ones who've gone before us declare this. They testify. They bear witness. It uses the word for martyr, but martyr didn't mean you died for your faith. It means bear witness. To bear witness or bear testimony. That's what the word martyr means. So their lives bear witness, testify to this reality that faith is the substance of things hoped for and not seen. Because now he's going to make that case. Verse 3, by faith we understand that, chapter 11, there's so much that I can't preach on Abraham and Noah and all of these little points. We have 2 weeks. We have this week and next week. So I have to motor through. I don't get to get down and dig into this. And neither did he. Because he goes, you know what, I don't have time. I got to keep moving. So there we go. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God. So that what is seen did not come from anything visible. Verse 4, by faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain. Through faith, he was commended as righteous when God approved of his gifts. And through faith, he still speaks, although he is dead. So here, the man of faith, I want to point out, the man of faith in this verse is Abel. So in Abel's life, did walking by faith mean it always went really perfectly and nicely for you? Is that what, did faith mean your brother didn't hit you on the head with a stone and kill you? It didn't. It didn't. Bad stuff happened to Abel. But it doesn't mean his faith still testifies to this day. His faith still, it doesn't mean God's promises fail. A life of faith did not equate to easy going. And we'll see through these lives that testify of what trust is, that each one had to trust God, even when the circumstances, especially when the circumstances seem to declare something different. It's very easy for me to have faith and trust when everything's flowing perfectly well. I mean, I love those times. Those are my favorite times to have faith. The times that are hard to have faith are when we especially need to have faith. And those are the times we have to spur one another on. When it looks bad, when you want to crumble up and die in the desert. When you go, I quit, I can't, where is God? You know, and it's all real, and the despair feels real, and it's overwhelming, and you can't find it, and you can't see clearly. All you can see is what's in your face. And the Lord calls us to trust and says, listen, not what you see, trust in what I said, what you don't see. Of course, we know very little of the next man mentioned, Enoch. We know that he was pleasing to God, and he's one of 2 men that didn't see death. By faith, the other one is Elijah, who said, God, kill me. You know, remember? He's like, please, God, take my life. You know, he prays for fire to come down, and it comes down. He prays for God to take his life, and never dies. So, God doesn't always give you what you ask for. So by faith, Enoch was taken so as not to see death, and he was not found because God took him. For before he was taken, he was commended as pleasing to God. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. For the one who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. It's impossible. Faith and trust are not peripheral. They're not secondary. People say, well, I need to walk, I need to do this list, this. I follow these things, I've got this list, I do all of this. None of that gets us jack squat. It's faith, trust is the starting point. People get afraid. And some people do, you see in the New Covenant scriptures where people accuse Paul of being what they call an antinomian, where they say, well, he's saying just you're free. And people are like, well, if you tell people they're free, then they're just going to go and do whatever pleases their physical body, and they're just going to walk in sin and hedonism. That's not what we're called to. What we're called to is to trust God, to trust what he says, to look to him. He says, I'm going to write a new covenant, and it's going to be on your heart. And the very nature of legalism in and of itself is technicalities. People like to get around based on technicalities. I don't want to get too far off, but in the news, there's been all this stuff about Harvey Weinstein and all these kinds of things. And all these other actors and actresses are putting out their statements like, oh, I never knew, and this is awful, and this is terrible, and there's this sort of sanctimony that's happening that everyone's going, oh, really? And this one guy, I read this article, this one guy, it's profanity laden, but he writes a basic post that says, we all knew. And he gets out there and confesses to how he was complicit and how he stood by and how he got rich by staying quiet and how then he apologized and took responsibility and without without letting himself off the hook at all. And that was real. All the other stuff is like. And so when we come to the Lord, if you come and you go, well, I'm going to do this, and this. Listen, if I trust God, I know this, the more I know him, the more I enter into his presence, the more I recognize who he is and all he's done for me. For real, I just want to please him. I just want to serve him. I know now that the things he has for me are good, so that purity and holiness is where life is. That there's abundant living in the boundaries that he has set. And it's beautiful. And I'm not confined by the boundaries. I'm in his love. And I'm not overwhelmed by trying to nitpick boundaries. I just got to stay in him and in his love and walk in that relationship to him. And some people get uncomfortable, like, well, but what exactly? I just want to know exactly what and it's like, just hey. No, knock it off. Let go of control and walk in relationship to him. And the closer I am to him, the more holy and righteous I'll be. If you've been here for any length of time, you know that in our preaching of the word here, I always want to preach the very heart of God and the love and the compassion and the tone. I want us to hear the tone of God's heart toward us. But that doesn't ever mean that we soften calling sin what it is. Because sin destroys. And it's, the analogy that I often will make is likening sin to heroin. that if you've got a child that you love, that the heroin, that's addicted to heroin, and it's killing them, is it loving to go, well, if I tell them they need to stop doing heroin and I step in and try to intervene in their lives, they're going to be angry with me. And I don't want them to be angry with me. So actually, I'm going to continue telling them it's fine. Keep killing yourself with heroin. I just don't want you to be uncomfortable with me. I just want you to know that I love you. No, that's not love. That's selfish. It's selfish. And a lot of people don't want to lovingly share the heart of God about what sin is because they selfishly don't want to engage in relationship and actually deal with the discomfort of saying, I love you enough to listen, hear me, hear the heart of God, and to walk in that. Okay, so we have to trust Him, always in that. Believe that He exists, believe that He rewards those who seek Him. And the word seek means like to exert, you've got to exert some effort. Not to be saved, but to pursue Him, to want God in your life. And at the end of Hebrews chapter 4 and Hebrews chapter 5, he deals with neglect, spiritual neglect. He says, you guys are like kindergartners and you're 18. And you should be going into college. You should be teachers of it, but you've been lazy. You've been wanting to be bottle fed. You're 18, wanting to be bottle fed. And he's like, no, you got to eat the meat, which involves, you got to do some cutting. You got to actually get involved in the process. Okay. Verse 7, by faith, when Noah, when warned about events not yet seen. So Noah is warned about events not yet seen. In holy fear, he prepared an ark for the safety of his household. Through faith, through his trust in what God said, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. He spoke a very uncomfortable truth that no one believed. Oh, Noah, don't say that. You're ridiculous. No one's ever even seen what you're talking about. He's insane. He was warned about events not yet seen. Verse 8, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called out to a place he was to receive as an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going. Not seen. Not seen. What is faith? The evidence of things, the substance of things hoped for. You know what's coming substantively because God said it. It's the evidence of what you don't see. I believe that same word, the confession, with trust what God said. Not knowing where he was going. By faith, verse 9, he migrated to the land of promise as if it were foreign, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was waiting for the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So Abraham's existence, think about this. So God makes Abraham this grand promise several times. And we know about it. I don't need to rehearse the whole thing. Over and over. I'm going to go to the land. I'm going to give you descendants as many as the stars. And he gets to the land. And he spends his years in the land waiting for that first son. Trying to make it happen, something, different things. Struggling through that. Living in tents. The big promise. That was louder than I thought. The big promise. And he's living in tents. Like a stranger in the very land God had promised. He was waiting, it says. He was waiting for the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. The word waiting there is endokse, to expect something to happen, to wait with expectation. So living in tents, he waited expectantly for the Lord to design and build the very city in which he would live. Verse 11, by faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive when she was barren and past the age, since she considered the one who had made the promise to be faithful. So from one, and him as good as dead, were fathered offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as uncountable as the sand on the seashore. Verse 13, These all died in faith without receiving the things promised. Now what it actually, but they saw them and welcomed them from afar, and they confessed that they were strangers and sojourners on the earth. It says, these all died in faith without receiving the promise. And it has to do with this idea is that not without receiving, is without fully seeing. There's a not yet implied in the language. Not yet having received the promise. They all died, and this can't include Enoch, because he didn't die. So, point, in the days that they lived and they breathed, these did not see the fulfillment of the promises in this lifetime. But they saw. They saw the bigger picture. They saw from a distance. They saw, it says, from afar. In fact, it says they welcomed them from a distance. They saw with happiness about something in the future. To anticipate with pleasure is what that word welcome them means. And then it says, and they confessed. There's that same word. They confessed that they were strangers and sojourners on the earth. They said, they set themselves, they gave that same word. They recognized what God said. That on this earth, we're strangers. On this earth, we're sojourners. Abraham in Genesis 23:4 says, I am an outsider and a sojourner among you. He says to the people, in the land God promised him when he wants to bury Sarah, give me a gravesite so I can bury my dead from before my presence. In Psalm 39, David, verse 12 says, hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Do not be silent at my tears, for I am a stranger with you, a sojourner like all my fathers. And then if you want to really be blessed and encouraged, if you read his prayer in 1 Chronicles 29, David says as he's praying about the temple that will one day be built. You'll remember, we call it, we know that Solomon built the temple. But the plans for the temple were given to Solomon by David. David loved the Lord so much that he had these plans. He gave them to his son, and his son did it to the specification that he had done. But David in his lifetime never saw that dream of his heart. But he says in 1 Chronicles 29:15, we are sojourners before you, and tenants. We're renters here. We're renters. This is a hotel. Think of it like the Holiday Inn Express, depending on where you live. Some of us live in the Motel 8. You're sojourners. We're tenants here, as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow. Our Lord God, all this abundance that we have provided to build you a house for your holy name is from your hand and all yours. I love that part of his prayer. Everything that we have provided, you gave us to give to you. It's like when you give your kids money to go birthday shopping for you. And then he goes on, verse 14, back in Hebrews 11:14. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If indeed they had been thinking about where they had come from, they would have had opportunity to return. If in the midst of struggle, they kept focusing on where they came from, there were chances to go back. Remember, he's saying, don't go back. Over and over, don't go back. Don't drift away. Don't move back from Yeshua. Don't step away from Yeshua. These guys were going toward the promise, and they hit obstacles. But they knew the promise was true. They had opportunities to look backward and go back, but they didn't. Verse 16, but as it is, they yearn for a better land, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. They died in a state of trust, never having seen their descendants receiving the land. Abraham didn't see with earthly eyes the fulfillment of his descendants being as numerous as the stars. David didn't see with earthly eyes the temple. He never saw it. What they had was their faith, their trust in God. They kept their eyes on the Lord. The true object of their deepest desire was God himself. And the city God had for them, foundations he had laid. And so consequently, it says God's not ashamed to be called their God. And there's a comparison, again, to those who shrink back. That he has no pleasure in those who shrink back. But those who continue trusting him. You say, if you said it, Lord, I can't see, but I know you. I trust you. I don't see. I don't trust me. I trust you. So the author here has paused to make a point. He's gone through these guys, and he stopped. He stopped to say, hey, these guys, they stopped breathing, not having fully grasped and seen what they would have considered the fulfillment of the promise. It had not yet been completely fulfilled. And so he says to these that are struggling in their faith, this congregation of believers in the book of Hebrews, he's saying, are you weary? Are you losing faith? Are you losing trust? Are you losing hope because of what your eyes are showing you? He talked to them at the end of chapter 10, don't you remember when you first came to faith? The persecution you went through? Perhaps the persecution seemed more temporary at first. Perhaps there was the sense that, okay, just hang in there. They take our stuff, we're going to make it. We're going to get through this. We're going to stand strong. But now that persecution has been a long temporary. It's been going on so long that they're tired. And they're beginning to wonder, they're beginning to doubt. And they're saying, how long, O Lord? How long? I trusted, but this is too much. This is lasting too long. I think on some level, on different points of our lives, we've all had those moments where we thought, okay, yeah, I can do this. And we get a burst of faith, a burst of trust. And then it's like that first sprint, how many of you were runners? Not me. I hated it. It was punishment for baseball players. So you'd be like, I can do this, and you run. You start sprinting. When you're not a good runner, you sprint out of the gate, and about however many yards it was, all of a sudden you're like, my side, and it hurts. And I thought I was going to be able to run this better, but now it's getting more painful. Now this race is seeming extra long, and I started with a burst, thinking no problem. And I didn't really know, I didn't fully grasp how, at times, this was really going to test me. Abraham's temporary was longer than he expected. But he trusted God. He believed God. It says he saw and welcomed the promise that seemed far away. So the writers basically encourage him, don't grow weary. Look at Abraham. Look what he went through. Don't stop short of the promise. You're so close. Wake up, he says. And you flash back to there have been a couple of exhortations through the book of Hebrews. Again, chapter 4:1 says, therefore let us fear, if while a promise remains of entering his rest, lest any of you seem to have come short of it. Be afraid of, you're so close. The movies where, they frustrate you all the way through. American Tail. Remember American Tail? Fievel looking for his father. And how many times they kind of cross paths and they're just about to, and something, keeps going on. And he's just about to give up. Remember at the end? And then when he's with all the orphans that say, forget about it, your family doesn't love you. Yeah, they don't love me. And he's just about to say, forget it, this is who I am. And all of a sudden, he hears his name. Father. And it makes me cry every time. I've seen this movie since I was 11 years old. And I know it's coming at the end. And I'm like, I'm not going to get emotional. But when his little ears go, Papa? Papa? Papa! Philo! Papa! Philo! And they run into each other's arms. I mean, it's like every time. I'm a wreck. I know it's coming. Okay, but the thing is, it's like you're talking to Bible. And you go. If you don't know how the movie ends, because the movie isn't determined yet, and he's just now going, you know what? Forget it. I'll never reach the place. I'll never find my Father. This is my identity. I quit. And everything in you goes, no! No! You're so close! He's riding on a big orange cat right around the corner. Hang on, Bible! And that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying. In their weariness, in their exhaustion, in their despair. He comes saying, you're almost there. Come on. Hang on. Keep your eyes fixed not on what you see, but on what is unseen. That's who we are. We are not the ones who shrink back. We are not the shrinking away ones, but we are the trusters. We are the ones who persevere with persevering trust, persevering faith. In Hebrews 6:11 and 12, it says, we long for each of you to show the same eagerness for the certainty of hope to the very end. You remember in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 6, it says, and you are indeed his house, if indeed you hold firm to the end. Hold that same word, to the end. Don't you die in the desert. You keep pressing on to what is unseen. You keep going toward what is unseen. Don't let what's in front of your face knock you down. Because right around the corner, the promise is there. And therefore it says God is not ashamed to be called their God. Continuing, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. Yes, he who had received the promises was offering up his one and only son. The one about whom it was said, through Isaac offspring shall be named for you. He reasoned that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. And in a sense, he did receive him back from the dead. So, I say this every time I talk about Abraham, and even about a lot of these guys, is that when you know the end of the story, because you've seen the movie so many times, you can, because this was real. It was his real journey and his real struggle. We can lose sight of the reality of what his faith involved. 75 years old, you get a promise that you're going to have a child, and you believe. He believed, okay? You say so? And he goes through this process, maybe 10 years later. Maybe not through me. The Lord says, no, through your very own body. And then Sarah begins to wonder, well, maybe not through me. And they work out the whole thing with Ishmael. And then all of that happens. And then finally, he's 99, she's 89. And the Lord himself shows up and says, hey, this time next year. This time next year. And he laughed at one point. Later, she laughed. And then this time next year, in their weakness, they struggled, but yet they still continue to trust God. And so it says here, so now we know Isaac is between ages 13 and 37. Because he's 37 when Sarah dies. So we know that he's somewhere in between there. So now, the one the Lord has promised, the one through whom he said, all your descendants are going to come through this, the Lord says, sacrifice him. And it says here that he reasoned. Now the word used here is logizomai, which means like logic. But it's to keep, he reasoned, but he kept a record. He remembered. It's to keep a record with some idea toward, for this, excuse me. Okay, my computer went black on me for a second. To keep a mental record of events for the sake of some future action. So what he did was he went back into his memory banks. And he said, well, first of all, God told me he was going to give me Isaac when I was 75. And it took a while, yeah. but it actually happened, and it was crazier than if it had happened when I was 75. I was 100, my wife was 90, and it happened. He said it, and it happened. So now he's telling me to do this. But he said that it's through Isaac that all these offspring are going to be reckoned. So maybe he'll raise him from the dead. It didn't matter how, and in one sense, because it says, and in one sense he did raise him from the dead, because it was as though he were dead in Abraham's own heart, because he was ready to obey the Lord. But the issue is, it didn't matter how God was going to do it. What he knew was, okay, Lord, I'll do it. I'm not sure how this is going to work out. But you said this, and the child came, took a long time, came. So if you said this, and now you're saying this, you're doing something. I don't know, but I will confess what you say. What you said is true. And he believed God. He remembered. Verse 20, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and he bowed in worship while leaning on top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when his end was near, made mention of the exodus of the children of Israel and gave instructions about his bones. I found that one to be really interesting because you think about, when you stop to think about Joseph, it would have been very easy for Joseph to get distracted by his power and by his position, by his status and by his wealth. And having been the number 2 in Egypt for as long, he's now been in Egypt for a long time, but he didn't lose sight of the promises of God to his father. And so he said, hey, listen, eventually, you guys are going to have to leave here. Here's the deal. Take my bones with you, because there's a promise for that land. It's not here. He didn't get distracted by the things of this world. And we don't think about that with Joseph, but that's the reality. Even after all of that, he didn't lose sight of how he had gotten there. That God that had brought him there was doing that for a purpose and was leading them somewhere else. And then we come to Moses, who we will find his faith is instilled in him from the moment he's born, as his mother exemplifies trust in God for her son. His whole life is defined by trust. The writer says, don't forget Moses. It actually tells us that his eyes were fixed on Messiah. Verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. So the faith there is of his parents, not the infant. Because they saw he was an extraordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's decree. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Instead, he chose to suffer mistreatment along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. He considered the disgrace of Messiah as greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to the reward. So, good grief, each of these is a message in itself, right? I mean, his parents feared God, trusted God more than they feared Pharaoh. And then he chooses short-term mistreatment with God's people instead of trading that for the passing pleasure of sin. The temptation for the people that that the writer of Hebrews is talking to is to kind of, let's just look, we're facing a lot of persecution. We can just lessen up the Yeshua talk. See, our Jewish family members aren't facing the pressure from the Roman government. They have a grandfather clause. They don't have to worship the emperor. But they're just distancing themselves from us. And so we're facing all of this stuff. If we would just lessen up the Yeshua talk, we could get rid of some of this persecution. We could ease up. So, let's deal with the passing pleasure of not getting persecuted. And maybe just not keep saying exactly the same word. In our society, the thing that you see here is that with Moses, his life is defined, in all of these, their life is defined by the substance of what is to come. It's not defined by what is. It's defined by what is going to come. What is not yet. Their lives are defined by holding firmly to the evidence that is invisible, instead of being defined by the visible, instead of being defined by the material. In our society, when someone speaks of materialism, we think of someone who's focused on wanting things, buying, owning things. But materialism is not just an idea that has to do with people wanting to possess things. A person is a materialist to the direct degree that they are limited in their perspective on the whole reality of the universe by only seeing what is materially analyzable, touchable, or sensible. Good grief. Sorry. Unfortunately, many of us whose lives are to be characterized by faith or trust, by focusing not on what is seen, but by focusing on what is unseen. Many of us are still bound by what is seen, by materialism. We're bound by what we can see. We define life. We define reality, what is real, by what is visible, by tangible things, the material. Instead of defining reality by what is unseen, what is hoped for, where we say, because God said, His word, His promise is true. The great heroes of faith, the great heroes of trust, understood that. And we are tempted in our materialism to get distracted and discouraged by the material, by the real, by what we call the real, the tangible. Ephesians chapter 6 tells us, look, your battle is not against what you think is real. Your battle is not against the material realm, no matter how much that might seem to be the case. You are fighting a battle in the invisible. And so these Jewish believers are discouraged by the extended nature of their temporary struggles, their temporary persecution, their temporary sojourn. And the writer here is saying, keep your eyes on the promise. Don't stop trusting. Don't die in the desert by succumbing to the passing pleasures of sin. Verse 27, continuing to speak about Moses, he says, by faith Moses left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger, for he persevered as if seeing the one who is invisible. So, what's the focus here? Moses doesn't get intimidated by the wrath of the most powerful king in the world. I mean, wisdom, earthly wisdom says, this dude's scary. This is the Pharaoh. Can't you see that? But Moses defied the king of Egypt. He left Egypt not fearing the wrath of the real king. Instead, it says he persevered based on the one he could not see. That's the one he feared. That's trust. That's faith. He says he persevered as if seeing the one who is invisible. He lived as though he lived with the walking concerning the things of God as though he could see them. That's his faith. So the writer's basically, is the emperor of Rome making your life difficult? Are you feeling pressure from family members to ease up on the Yeshua stuff? To settle back into the things you agree with, all for the sake of peace, all for the sake of no conflict? Wouldn't it just be easier to just ease up based on those you do see, rather than on the one you don't see? So he says, spur one another on. Challenge one another. Press the issue. Look at those who went before. Abraham, Joseph, Moses. And don't forget, we know how their stories end, but they didn't. The life of faith and trust never equaled comfort. And the things in front of their eyes didn't look like guarantees. Just because you know the end of the story, they obeyed not knowing the end of the story, still knowing the real end of the story. Here's what they knew. They don't know how it's going to end, how it's all going to lead up to its end, but what they knew is God is true, He's faithful, and what He said He'll do. I don't know all the chapters between now and the end of the book, but I know that He will bring it to fruition. Continue out Moses. By faith, he kept the Passover and the smearing of the blood, so the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch them. It's like, how would that make any sense? But he just trusted the word of God. God said so, you salute and say, yes, Lord. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as if on dry ground. When the Egyptians tried it, they were swallowed up. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were circled for 7 days. Of course. Of course. That's what happens when you walk around walls for 7 days. Everybody knows that. That's why I don't like to do Jericho marches. No, I'm just kidding. You were like, let's do Jericho March. I'm like, you know what happened when they did that last time? The building fell. No, just kidding. We want to talk about a crazy battle plan. By verse 31, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she welcomed the spies with shalom. How about Rahab's faith? Here, she hadn't walked through the sea. She hadn't seen the manna. She had only heard. She had not seen. She had only heard. And yet she trusted the God of Israel. And even dealing with her own people, against her own people. Yeshua said to Thomas, because you've seen me, have you believed? Blessed are those who did not see and yet believed. He continues, what more shall I say? For time would fail me, as it is failing me. If I tell of Gideon, of Barak, of Samson, of Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets. He's afraid he's getting long-winded, so he wants to keep making the point. By faith, they conquered kingdoms. By faith, they administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of the fire, escaped the edge of the sword. They were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, and made foreign armies flee. Women received their dead raised back to life, and others were tortured after not accepting release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And I love this, how mid-verse, verse 35, he goes from those who, women received their dead back to life, they were women of faith, and others had looked forward to a different resurrection. Others refused to compromise for a short-term fix, and so they died in order that they might obtain a better resurrection. The resurrection of those sons to those mothers, powerful move of God. But the resurrection that these others died knowing they were going to get, that's a better one, superior. Verse 36, others experienced the trial of mocking and scourging. Yes, and even chains in prison. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. They were murdered with the sword. They went around in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute, afflicted, mistreated. All of these people are people who trusted God. Abel was killed. Just because you trust God doesn't mean that in this life that what you see will always match up to what you think you should see. God points us toward a better promise, toward eternity, and toward what He's doing, toward what He says. And they're getting mistreated. These believers are getting weary. And they're saying, wait a minute, where is God in all of this? And He's saying, hey, don't die in the desert. Don't give up. Keep pressing through. There's a better resurrection. It says the world, verse 38, the world was not worthy of them. They wandered around in deserts and mountains, caves and holes in the ground. And all these, though commended for their faith, did not receive, and again, did not yet receive is the idea, what was promised. They didn't yet see and get yet what was promised. Because God had provided something better for us, so that only with us would they reach perfection. And the idea is that there was something coming in Yeshua, that the completion, the perfection, the totality of what they were looking for culminates in Him. And then we move, so He's challenging them, He's spurring them on. Who are we? We're not the shrinking back ones. We're the righteous ones who live by faith and trust. That's who we are. We're the trusters. There's Abel, there's Noah, there's Enoch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Rahab, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets, Daniel, the three boys in the fiery furnace, Elijah, the mothers who received back their dead, the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and you and me. We are going to be numbered with them. That's who we are. They stayed firm to the end. That's what you're going to do. That's what we're going to do. We're going to finish. We're going to be among that crowd. We're going to be put at the end of the book of Hebrews 11. We're being added to this. You are. Your parents that serve the Lord to the very end. We're going to finish this. And our names are being added. We are, as we go into eternity, we become a part of a great cloud of witnesses. And so he goes into Hebrews chapter 12. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let's just get rid of every weight and entangling sin. Let's run with endurance the race set before us, focusing on Yeshua, the initiator and perfecter of our faith. He says, therefore, these witnesses are cheering us on. Let's run. So we're back. We're on the track. We're on the track. But so many of these believers are carrying. They're trying to run, dragging all of this stuff. I got this, got that, lay it down, shed it. Let it go. And this is every entangling sin. And the picture of entangling has more to do with having a noose around your neck, or like a bridle, that sin has you. It says, stop. It says, lay it aside. Take it off. Stop. Be free. And begin to run with freedom. And while these are cheering us on, they're in the crowd cheering us on. Yes, we've talked about them, but don't fix your eyes on them. Don't fix your eyes on your dad who went before you. Don't fix your eyes on Abraham and Moses. Don't fix your eyes on them. Fix your eyes on Yeshua, because he's the one who's the author, who's the initiator, who's the one who started this work in you, and he's the one who will bring it to perfection, completion, fulfillment. He's the one who started this story, and he will finish it. So fix your eyes on him. Throw off all the stuff that's slowing you down. Stop it. Stop getting distracted. Stop looking at the crowd. Stop it. Just fix your eyes on him, he says. It says, he's the initiator and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and he has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary in your souls and lose heart. We've looked at Abraham, we've looked at David and Moses, all these witnesses, but at the end of the day, don't fix your eyes on them. Fix your eyes on Yeshua. I'm almost done. The very one who started your journey is the one who will bring it to completion. The one through whom all things are held together. The one who we read in chapter 1 is the exact representation of the very nature of God. He is the radiance of God. That very one. Fix your eyes on him, because he endured. He endured the cross. He disregarded the shame of the cross. He endured hostility. The sinless one who had come to save sinners endured hostility by those very sinners. Yeshua focused not on what was seen in front of his eyes, but on what was unseen. Sure, Abraham and Moses and Joseph endured and disregarded, set aside the passing pleasures of sin. But Yeshua, they're all leading to him. Fix your eyes on him. Stop looking at the crowd and struggling against sin. I want to get to just halfway through chapter 12. It's going to take me a couple minutes. In struggling against sin, you have not, because next week we have to do the back end of chapter 12 and 13, and we're done. Okay. In struggling against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of bloodshed. So these guys, he's saying, others have had it worse, by the way, including Yeshua. Have you forgotten the warning addressed to you as sons? My son, do not take lightly the discipline of Adonai, or lose heart when you are corrected by him. Because Adonai disciplines the one he loves, and punishes every son he accepts. It is for discipline that you endure. God is treating you as sons, as children. For what child does a father not discipline? If you are without discipline, something all have come to share, then you are illegitimate and not children. Besides, we are used to having human fathers as instructors, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? Indeed, for a short time they disciplined us as seemed best in them. But he does so for our benefit, so that we may share in his holiness. Now, all discipline seems painful at the moment, not joyful. Never. Never. Never does discipline ever feel like, yay! You're taking away my privileges? Awesome! Right? In that moment, it's like, you hate me. You know, parents, your kids say, you don't love me. You think that. How can this be love? And the Lord says, this is a whole other section. I talk about discipline enough in the years that God brings us through discipline because of his love for us. And so in our hardship, to recognize that there are things that we only get, that we only awaken to in hardship. I mean, there's, when I'm perfectly comfortable, I mean, I make the same analogy every time, but on Sunday morning, when I'm sitting on my couch, watching the Miami Dolphins possibly win, they did this amazingly. I'm not like, this is super comfortable. This really inspires me to change my life. In the midst of comfort, we don't go, something's got to change. We actually say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right? It's funny how you'll see this in a relationship with, like, I'll just say the husband-wife relationship, where we'll say, our wives will say, they'll what men will call nag it, and, you know, I need you to do this. Well, if you would just talk to me nicely, I'd be happy to do it. Okay, and then she asks nicely. And we're like, oh yeah, sure thing, no problem. And then we don't do it. And we don't do it, and we don't do it, and then she's like, oh, why aren't you doing this? It's like, good grief. What's your problem? We only seem to recognize sometimes when they get frustrated with us, right? And you know, I see this with my kids where I'm like, you know, I'll be talking to them and I'll ask them nicely, and then finally where I'm like, you know, not nice, and they're like, Dad, why are you so intense? And I'm like, that's a good question. I love being asked that question. Anyway, but all discipline, so even with the picture of the race though, the discipline is also preparing us for endurance, right? Runners, long distance runners, those who they have to go through training. And he talks about that, how discipline seems painful at the moment, but later it yields peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. In our lives, we can allow pain to make us bitter, or we can allow it to train us. Okay? We can allow it to make us better. Ugh, I hate cliches, but it's so good. It can make you bitter or better, right? It's true. We can allow pain to be like, oh, nothing ever good goes my way. Or we can say, Lord, what are you trying to form in me? In the midst of, why, oh God? If we stop and say, okay, Lord, is there something? Give me ears to hear. What is it you're trying to produce in me? What is it you want to form in me? Make me more like you. Therefore, this is the last two verses. Therefore, because it's in the same context. Therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble. So you got the runner. And make straight paths for your feet so you're not turning your ankles, right? So that what is lame will not be pulled out of joint, but rather be healed. So we'll get more into that next week. But there's this picture of now run. Recognize your training for what it is. Recognize the challenge. Recognize the discipline. And let it create endurance in you. And keep running. And fix your eyes on Yeshua. And don't go backward. And don't stop. And throw all the other junk aside. And and all of this is just coming to this amazing conclusion of what the writer has been bringing, what the Holy Spirit is wanting to show us all along. That you can enter now. You have Yeshua. He's better, a better covenant. You can enter boldly into his throne. So he's got something better for you. He's got a promise for you. So don't die in the desert because of an evil heart of unbelief, he says in chapter 4. An evil heart of unbelief. Faithlessness, a lack of trusting God to do what God said he'll do, is no small deal to God. So in our weakness, when your faith is weak, God says to me, you spur them on. And when my faith is weak, you spur me on. And you say no. Because the enemy will attack us. He'll attack you in your moment of weakness. And you'll want to go into isolation. And then he's got you all to himself. To fill your mind with lies. So the writer says, you keep going to God, keep approaching his throne, and don't you stop meeting together. You keep encouraging one another. You keep spurring one another. You keep reminding them about Abraham and Noah and Jacob and Joseph, and you keep speaking the word of God and how they kept their eyes on what was unseen, and you keep your eyes on what is unseen, but above all, fix your eyes on Yeshua and run, and let the discipline make you stronger. Amen?